everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Paideia Today. As always, I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and I am joined, as always, by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we are doing something rather different. We are going to be talking about a Russian author. Dr. Masson and I had something of a conversation a few months ago discussing about whether or not we wanted to come around and talk about some of the most famous Russian authors who are extant, and the consensus ultimately was yes. We think that this would be a valuable addition to Paideia Today. So today we are dealing with one of the towering figures, I would argue, not of merely Russian literature, but literature overall. Many great writers and thinkers consider this author to be one of the finest who has ever put pen to paper. And of course, we're talking here about Dostoevsky. I'm transliterating his name for those of you who prefer more traditional pronunciation. And so I apologize for that if that strikes you as a miss. But we're getting at one of his, well, he's written quite a number of strong texts, some of them quite short, some of them novella length, some of them full novel length. And we've gone after the novel today. And I'm speaking here very specifically about the great novel Crime and Punishment, one of the towering novels in Western literature, I would argue. And it's written by an absolutely fascinating man. So many of these authors that we're talking about have fascinating personal details which inform their intellectual and artistic sensibilities in these great works. And so we need to talk a little bit about the man himself. Dr. Masson, you know something of these matters. Would you care to share something of that with us?
So yeah, I did want to say a few words about Dostoevsky's autobiography or his biography because it informs some of the features of the novel, so it seemed appropriate. But he's, in terms of chronology here, born in 1821, dies in 1881. So there is some overlap with the writer we did last time, Tennyson, so in the Victorian era, roughly. He's a bit, it's a very different context there, being in Russia, very much influenced by Napoleon and the French Revolution and the revolutionary politics of the day, which had spread from France throughout the entirety of Europe. We can see in many of Dostoevsky's own novels and that of other Russian authors this idea of a sort of aristocracy informed by French ideas, and the aristocrats themselves even speak French. So in some ways, I guess if you were from the Anglosphere, it would be similar to the Norman Conquest, which the aristocrats are speaking French while the peasants are still speaking Anglo-Saxon, or in this case, Russian. But the ideals of Napoleon are there very much. And Dostoevsky, as a young man, was moving. He went to a military college, didn't take much interest in it, but he was in the circles of those interested in these utopian socialist ideas, very much of the sort also that would be appealing to utilitarian ideas, the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people, all of which have the upshot of meaning that the individual matters not. And the great man, of whom Napoleon is the exemplar without parallel, is able to transcend social and moral codes. In fact, he not only rises above them, but to some degree he tramples them under his feet. He's the Ubermensch, the man who is above these sorts of things. We can see this in fictional portraits throughout the 19th century. We even saw it to some degree in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We spoke about that in relation to Victor, who is a man who dug up dead bodies, did things that were literally unthinkable, but he did it so for the sake of humanity. And likewise, Walton, who he meets, is a similar sort of scientific figure, pushing the boundaries of science in defiance of moral considerations. This man is portrayed throughout the 19th century as somebody who is very much of an idealist. And it seems to be not just the context of Russia, but the intellectual ferment of the entire European continent. And we were saying before we started recording that to some degrees it doesn't end until the First World War. And even then, arguably, it doesn't end either, because it fires the ideas of the Nazis, the idea of the Ubermensch and the superior, in this case, race. At this point, it's not in such racialized terms, but this is the age of nationalism in the nation state, and it's very tribalistic, and certainly there are ideas of progress connected with the great deeds of individuals. Anyway, Dostoevsky's moving in these circles. He is seen as such as being seditious, and he is not only judged but is convicted of these crimes, and he is put before a firing squad. And it gets so far as he is literally in front of them when his sentence is commuted by a man coming on a horse, relieves him or alleviates him of his punishment and sentences him instead to 8 years of hard labor. And so this extraordinary sequence, you can only imagine what sort of effect it would have on your life, being in front of a firing squad. The guns are about to shoot, and then the horse comes in, commutes your sentence. Well, for Dostoevsky, it seems to have had some sort of transformative effect. We know from his letters that even before he went off to Siberia to serve his sentence, he wrote in a letter that life is a gift. There's some sort of a positive response to these events, whether it's from the death sentence being commuted, or even in the idea of being sentenced to hard labor. There's some sort of positive transformation that was intensified as he went to the labor camp with a copy of the New Testament, which he worked over so thoroughly that his thumbprints are all over the copy that he had, which we still have. And when he emerged from that work camp, he was a transformed individual, and his Christianity very much informs all of his novels. We can speak about what particular variety of Christianity and so forth he has, but the 8-year sentence that he serves is very much akin to that which his protagonist, Raskolnikov, will also serve here. In Raskolnikov's case, for 2 murders; in Dostoevsky's case, probably for being of the wrong political persuasion. All the same.
He was reading the wrong material. He had forbidden material. I think, if memory serves me correctly, he had also handed the materials on to other individuals. Yes. And that, of course, was the tipping point when it came to sentencing him to death. My own sense of this, and again, it's just my own sense, is that the firing squad was never a real firing squad. This was essentially, this was meant to taught these seditious individuals a lesson. And there's a later writer we probably won't talk about, Flannery O'Connor, who writes a very famous short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. And at the end of the story, the murderer there says, of the protagonist who he has just murdered, he says that, she would have been a good woman had there been somebody around to shoot her every 5 minutes of her life. Right. And Dostoevsky actually literally undergoes that moment. And you're right, it seems to have been transformative. The Dostoevsky prior to the firing squad is an intellectual. You don't often get that immediately when you're reading his literature, by the way. His characters can be rather flighty. Occasionally they can be shallow. They tend to be highly emotional. You don't get a sense of that deep sort of intellectual and artistic knowledge. But we know for a fact that Dostoevsky was continuously reading the greatest thinkers of his day. He was sending out requests for certain texts from philosophers and people like this in his letters. We have these requests. So there's a lot going on there. So the Dostoevsky prior to the firing squad is a very intellectually ambitious individual. And as you have already said, quite rightly, I think, he catches up on the spirit of his age, the zeitgeist of his age in the second half of the Victorian period and leading up to the apocalypse of the Great War. That there are certain great individuals whose greatness is typified by the fact that they've moved beyond mere good and evil, to quote Nietzsche. These people are not held to the same accounts as people traditionally within the expectations of society and Christianity and what have you. These people are not held back by those constraints. In fact, it is almost their duty to exceed these sorts of boundaries. And of the very mark of their greatness for many of these characters is the extremely horrific deeds they do in the name of progress. This becomes an exciting idea that this great person will do what nobody else dares to do. I would argue this goes back at least to Goethe's character of Faust, who we didn't talk about.
No, but we mentioned, and you're right, and rightly so.
Yeah, so that starts a process going, I think, that really explodes into a common spirit of the age. And it's not just in Russia, it's not just in France. It's a very cosmopolitan spirit.
I think it goes before that. I think it's the seeds of it are in the early 18th century in this debate over art, over whether the greatest art is done in conformity to some pattern, that of the ancients, or whether it is in accordance with nature, which is the modern's position. And Shakespeare becomes the symbol of the natural genius, as it were, who doesn't obey any laws. He doesn't follow the patterns of or prescriptions that the French Académie Française is putting out there, Aristotelian basically. And the idea that because of that, he plays to his own tune, more or less. He is able to do greater art than had been thought before. So then he becomes the example of this sort of lawless genius who obeys the law of his own nature. But his nature is not the nature of everyone else's nature. There's a special dispensation, as it were, that has gifted him to do things that are unthinkable for the hoi polloi, the common people. And I think that is also probably what Dostoevsky was thinking, but it's certainly, and this is not in dispute, what Raskolnikov is writing and thinking. He is hoping, remember he's a university student, to be this sort of great man. And this is what leads him to contemplate the crime which he ends up committing, which is an unspeakable thing. And he does it for the sake of human progress. He believes that he's eradicating from the earth a horrible individual, somebody who's a moneylender, a terrible individual, and he's going to purge her from the earth, and thereby he is going to he's going to liberate them from that. And also with her money and that of her sister, also gets murdered, with that money he's going to extend his own education. So there's a utility to it, and the utility is that it will serve the great man's ends to be even greater and to help more people. Well, this is the sort of help he provides, is by killing those who are, in his judgment, immoral.
Yeah, these are people who it's not even so much that this money lender is even so much in his way. It's almost, it has the spirit with Raskolnikov almost of a psychological experiment. This is an important aspect actually of the craft of this novel. This novel moves very solidly in the traditions of the psychological novel. In fact, I would say that this is a big revolutionary step in the evolution of the psychological novel. A lot of what happens in this novel happens in the mind of Raskolnikov.
True.
And so the plot is very, very much bound up in, I wouldn't quite describe it as a stream of consciousness, but it is rather akin in certain places to a stream of consciousness novel, such as you might discover on the part of Virginia Woolf or somebody like this. In any event, Raskolnikov has this vision of himself, as you say, as this kind of Ubermensch. He's not constrained by the laws for mere mortals and what have you. He's has delusions, not even of grandeur, but of godhood. He's going to chart his way forward in almost the spirit of the Romantics here. And it just turns out that the money lender is kind of sort of in his way, but not really. It's an idea that he's going to experiment with how far he can push it beyond the laws of good and evil by murdering her. And initially he doesn't do it. This is one of the things where I think Dostoevsky really shows his wisdom. He knows, as he's writing this, I believe it was first published in 1866, This is well after his period of, quote, execution and his time in the gulags, the labor camps of Siberia, his exile out there. He knows that people, especially younger people, have this delusion that they're one of the anointed ones who are beyond good and evil. This is a common delusion that young people suffer from in Western education at this time, and I would argue to this very day.
Yes, for sure.
But when he actually does the unthinkable, because he does murder the money lender and her sister, then all of a sudden he discovers he's not actually this person here who's beyond good and evil. The pangs of conscience and guilt begin to haunt him and eventually completely unravel him in a fascinating process as he just comes to pieces. Ultimately, plot spoiler, he confesses his murderers to everybody who matters and is sentenced accordingly, like the actual author himself was, to time in a labor camp in Siberia. So this is one of the reasons we're talking about his biography, because there are a lot of points of connection between us, Raskolnikov and the author himself. What else do we want to say about this?
Well, so there are three dimensions, at least three dimensions to the novel. On the one hand, there is Dostoevsky's own biography, which informs it. So it's a deeply personal novel. I think it reflects on things that he's able to write about so convincingly, I think, because he has actually thought these thoughts himself, probably gone and trod without having committed murder, had the thoughts of Raskolnikov himself at one point. So there's his individual experiences there. There's also his Christian faith, and that's going to play out in the novel in various ways, not just in terms of its the plot line of the murderer, the convicted, and then the redeemed. That sort of trajectory, but also repeated references to biblical stories. One in particular, that of Lazarus, that keeps popping up at three points in the novel. So very important. So he was dead and he was raised from the dead and so forth. So that's there. But then he also, and we mentioned this already, the contemporary application of the personal element, the fiduciary element, the element of his own faith, but he's applying it to his contemporary world and the politics of his day. So it's very much part of the spirit of its age, even though it is dealing with the universal themes and ideas of Christianity. It's very much applied in his day. By the way, this word Ubermensch, it just occurred to me. I don't know if we clarified this in this podcast before or not. It's almost untranslatable because it's actually from mountain climbing. The Ubermensch is the top man. If there are two mountain climbers, the one at the top of the rope is the Ubermensch. The one at the bottom end is the Untermensch. So if you think about it, Untermensch, and by the way, in the Nazi eras were the inferior human beings. Well, that ended up being basically everybody who wasn't the Ubermensch, and they were being hoisted up by the rope from the Ubermensch. The Ubermensch, they were sort of a drag on the Ubermensch. How high up could the Ubermensch go if he cut loose the Untermensch? That's the question. But there's a sense that the Untermensch is not bound by a common humanity, but rather is like a ballast that's holding the Ubermensch down, and they act accordingly. And to some degree, you're right, Raskolnikov almost decides to kill her not out of moral considerations, she just happens to be there, and he wants to see whether he can be that Ubermensch he dreamed he could be, and then finds out that he can't. And then the layer of the plot unfolds for the first time, that this man has a conscience, and the moral law which he had sought to deny by killing the old moneylender has been awakened, and that gives rise to greater richness in the plot.
Yeah, it's so much to say here. One of the things that makes Dostoevsky so fascinating is that he wrote extensive notes, volumes and volumes of notes around not just his works of literature, but also his contemplations on various topics and things like this. When he was serving his time, he spent 4 years ultimately in the Siberian labor camp, doing hard labor, a time that was very, very difficult on him because his health was not good right from the beginning. He was He was a relatively frail individual. And he encountered a person in the labor camp who was actually a murderer. And one of the things that fascinated Dostoevsky was that this murderer seemed to be haunted not at all by the slightest pangs of conscience about what he had done. And given the right circumstances, Dostoevsky observed, he would, without any pangs of conscience at all, kill again. As soon as it became convenient and he thought he could get away with it, he's going to do it again. And so this became a fascinating kind of character study for him. And then, of course, he begins to add these layers that you're talking about, that you might have the illusion that your faith has no hold upon your conscience. But in fact, that's exactly what it is. It's an illusion. And then after the dark deed, 99.999% of us suddenly begin the process of haunting as we unravel in the wake of what we have done, the laws we have violated, the codes of conscience, and so on and so forth. So this makes him a very, very fascinating individual. Also, like you said, this was a great age where your faith, your philosophy, your theology, all these sorts of things were not meant to be necessarily private things. They were things that you shared. These were things that explicitly informed your art or your writings and stuff of that sort. You would share them with other individuals in various intellectual salons and what have you. There's a lot of intellectual activity as to what the ideal form of government is, for instance, in Tsarist Russia. And so Dostoevsky is also relatively explicit about his thought processes when it comes to the faith. He was an Orthodox Christian. He had deep reservations about Catholicism, even greater reservations about Protestantism. He thought that the best aspects of Slavic and Russian identity were bound up with the Orthodox faith, and these two things worked together to metamorphose into something almost entirely unique. That was the inheritance of the Russians. So we have a lot of that going on. We know that his faith was also quite real and meaningful. One of the things we haven't spoken about in here yet is the fact that the author himself tended to write his novels by way of dictation. And that's important for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that's important is because he was lent a stenographer to get the job done in time. He had to turn out some of his novels in great haste, and a stenographer was a very handy way with which to do it. And ultimately, his real stenographer, I think her name was Anna, he ends up marrying her, which is a considerable age gap because he himself was well into his 40s when he married this 19-year-old stenographer. But they seem to have had an extremely healthy, extremely Christian marriage. One of the upshots of this was the fact that she was largely responsible for helping him and coaching him and praying him through his gambling addiction. He had a very serious gambling addiction that seriously undermined his life right up until pretty close to the end, when he managed to beat the gambling addiction, pay off the debts that he had accrued in the process thereof, and what have you. So we've got this going on as well. There was another thing I wanted to talk about there, but it's kind of gone out of my head. Oh yeah, that was it. Dostoevsky is one of these authors who, he's just a towering figure, and many, many, many of the most famous writers and thinkers after Dostoevsky make note of him as a fundamental influence on their thinking, on their art, on their sense of their selves and their worlds and what have you. But occasionally you'll get a person who likes to criticize the author, particularly at the level of craft. And so one of the things that's said is that the Dostoevsky doesn't very cautiously put together his novels. The architecture of his novels, the craft of his novels is rather haphazard, and that this creates a degree of chaos. One famous individual said that if you skip so much as a page or two in Crime and Punishment, you'll have no idea why the plot is proceeding as it does. I think this is a little bit unfair.
Let me get this straight. So the problem is that he doesn't observe a plot structure that you can outline on Spark Notes or whatever these online tools are for helping undergraduates understand the structure of plots and so forth. Is that it, more or less?
Yeah, and this I think is the case oftentimes with both Dostoevsky and also with Tolstoy to some extent, is that if you just read the novel at first stop, and on kind of a surface level, as you say, a Sparks Notes level, you oftentimes don't understand the complexity of the ideas that are being that are informing the action. It's a little bit like reading the Divine Comedy or reading Paradise Lost. If you just try to skim it, you won't understand that you're reading something that is responding to some of the most complex philosophical notions that have ever been written about and stuff of this sort here. The same is true of Dostoevsky. We do know, thank goodness, that while he composed his novels by dictation, this was not a spontaneous composition. Dostoevsky was famous and in some circles infamous for writing enormous amount of notes as he prepared to dictate his novels, so much so
Like
that we have,
Tennyson.
yes, and so we literally have volumes and volumes and volumes of notes leading up to the actual text itself. And these have survived to us, by the way. So they're a fascinating repository of study in and of themselves. And we know that in the case of Crime and Punishment, initially it was planned as a novella, and then it began to take on a life of its own. And so that big volume of notes in preparation for the novella was superseded by a dependent second volume of notes and preparation and brainstorming and organization and planning and revision for a larger text. And then there was a third big sort of set of notes that finally preceded the actual novel itself, Crime and Punishment. So as you said, like Tennyson, Dostoevsky seems to be one of these writers who can revise his way to greatness, which makes a mockery of this notion that the best art is always spontaneous. And it also makes a mockery of the accusation that the man can't plan a plot. It is extraordinarily planned in some respects, but on the other hand, it is a plot shaped by its ideas and material instead of the other way around. And that
Even
to
by
me is
even by the Christian themes that we referred to, right? The idea of a sin that really defies any rational description. And remember, this is in the context of an age of rationalism.
Mhm.
He's portraying an act for which we, the reader, see no plausible reason that could lie behind it. I mean, we can appeal to, as I said, the idea of the Ubermensch, but that isn't sufficient to explain why he should do such a terrible thing. And then also when he does so and commits a second murder for the sake of the money, he doesn't take the money, which seems to be totally irrational as well. But again, what Dostoevsky observes, which is characteristic of any just estimation of human nature, is that we're not actually wholly to be described as rational creatures. It's not that we're not capable of reasoning, but that does not summarize the fullness of human conduct or even the motivations for it. There's something deeply irrational in many actions and even contradictory, self-contradictory. And he exposes that here in this figure of Raskolnikov. And how would a novel structure itself other than the way in which he's done it? I don't know. But you can see the idea of the Christian themes being played out in the novel from his own sin, from his conviction, from his confession, and from his transformation, and towards the end, really a sort of a moral sanctification going on towards the end of the novel. Yeah.
Yeah, he there's a number of, they're not really philosophical movements. They concern the philosophy, I suppose, primarily of politics, but there's a few schools of thinking to whom Dostoevsky is explicitly responding here. One of them is a French school of political philosophy known as Utopian Socialism.
Yep.
And of course, we see in the wake of the nightmares of Stalin and Lenin and people like this, that ends in nightmare. It's wildly unrealistic as a political and social model. It doesn't
That
work.
doesn't mean that it was ever dropped.
No, and it's back again.
Yeah.
We also have another phrase that he likes using to describe a certain school of thinking, which is rational nihilism. He said at a certain point he accused Russian intellectuals of being given over to rational nihilism, that is to say, reason in the service of nothing in particular, that usually ends, you guessed it, in nightmare. And so prescient were a lot of the themes that Dostoevsky gets at in his novels, that many people describe him as something of a prophet figure. He saw the coming horrors of the Russian Revolution. He
Of
saw
the
the coming
Gulag.
horror of the
Yeah.
gulags. He saw the coming horror of the Stalinist reigns of terror and things like this. And it's all largely predicated upon the thematic concerns bound up with the protagonist here, with Raskolnikov.
Yep.
Raskolnikov has these deadly illusions that he can move beyond traditional models of good and evil and become this individual who will attain this kind of utopia that socialism makes available. We also have to remember that Dostoevsky is writing in an age where, let's face it, your average Russian had good reasons for being unhappy with governmental models. Life for many people, like, the poor intellectual here, Raskolnikov, was extraordinarily difficult and hard. Living conditions in Russia on average were not just hard, they were oppressive, they were brutal, they were nasty. Let's not pretend that there's something that they weren't, and that socialism and communism found a fertile ground in which to grow here in Russia. There's a reason that actually happened.
Yeah,
We
it's
all
interesting. It's interesting in the light of what Marx thought about where his communism would take hold. He thought it would be in the most advanced countries, as because it would be the next stage, again, thematically consistent, that the progress would be the most advanced civilizations would be the ones that would embrace communism. And in fact, it was the most backward country in Europe, Russia, which did. So Dostoevsky has, if Marx gives the whole scheme of communism, Dostoevsky really analyzes the sort of seed ground in which it will really take hold. And that is, surprisingly, or perhaps to him not surprisingly, that of the impoverished and the degraded and the desperate.
Yeah, it's also, we need to remember that this is the novel refreshingly doesn't just leave us with a dark vision of the Ubermensch and his disaster, which many authors here with increasing regularity explore this notion. So if you want to look to literature for things which explain and warn against the worst excesses of the first half of the 20th century, they're not hard to find. But later on, we're going to look at Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, where we encounter another Ubermensch figure. There, the novel ends in darkness itself, predictably.
True.
And Crime and Punishment does not. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really a mature, masterful piece of work. A lot of people complain there. By the way, there are 6 parts to Crime and Punishment, and then there's an epilogue at the end. And there is a species of critic who dislikes the epilogue. In the epilogue of the novel is where Raskolnikov begins not even the redemptive process. I would go further and say the process of sanctification out there in the labor camp. And he goes out there with this young woman who was forced into prostitution by her family's
Anya.
dire circumstances, Sonia, exactly. And so she lives in the town nearby the labor camp where Raskolnikov has been sentenced and is serving his time. And she gives Raskolnikov a cross to take in there with him as a sort of a meditative tool, just as the actual Dostoevsky was given a Bible, and it's the only thing he was allowed to take in there. By the way, somebody had slipped into all the Bibles that were given to that batch of prisoners a 10 ruble note, so they had a little bit of buying power while they were in there. Anyway, so this is where the process of redemption and sanctification can really sort of begin as a process. Remember, these are Orthodox Christians, so they tend to be very sort of process oriented when it comes to their faith.
What's really interesting, Bill, to me when I read this, I read it as a Protestant, as would you. He confesses his guilt, and he's convicted for that. A Protestant would want to see this as the point at which he is transformed. But when he goes into the prison in the epilogue, and it's considering his confession and his choice to confess rather than to commit suicide, he doesn't see it as anything other than this arising out of weakness on his part. So there isn't a transformation that's going on there in the sense of a conviction of his guilt. Really, he'd chosen to confess almost out of Yeah, as he says, weakness, and not out of genuine conviction, out of strength, but rather the opposite.
Hmm.
And he doesn't see it as as he says in the words of the novel, a presentiment of future resurrection and a new life. He doesn't see it as that. But Sonia prevails upon him, and it's her constant care for him that I think in the end wins him over to some degree. So it's not his confession, it's not a verbal transformation. There's very much not a Protestant understanding of transformation of faith. It's more of a lived out experience that brings this about. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's confusing to Western Protestant readers such as myself, this clearly Christian depiction, and yet not really following the idea of confession and faith.
Yeah, I think Catholic readers of the novel will be much more in tune with this aspect of what is processing and what is developing. And I think most Orthodox intellectual Christians will immediately, this will resonate. Um, I should also mention in passing that as in real life, Anna, his stenographer and then wife, coached him through and redeemed him from a number of problems, but gambling first and foremost.
Yeah.
So also we see Sonia doing a similar sort of a thing when it comes to the spiritual maturation of Raskolnikov in the wake of the disaster that was. So lots of points of connection there.
So
I don't
again,
want to,
biography. Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to overemphasize that
No, nor
because
I, but it's there.
yeah, I get nervous when all the professor wants to talk about around the novel is how the novel is a reflection of the biography of the author and stuff like this, and that there is no boundary and so on and so forth. No, there is a boundary. So I think we need to approach that critically and intelligently, and not merely accept a seamless crossover. But nevertheless, there are these interesting bridges, which brings me to another point here. You and I are reading this sadly in translation. This is something you and I have spoken about in previous podcasts, that when you read something in translation, if it's a really eloquent, genius creation on the part of an author, much of the artistry sadly is lost to us. And so is also the case here. For instance, I am told, though I can't verify it myself, that the actual title, Crime and Punishment, has a sense of a carrying across of something. So in this case here, we're starting off with the bad, foolish man, and he's being carried across to some other type of creature on the other side. And the beginning of the novel begins with him also crossing a bridge from the hot, dank, nasty St. Petersburg, and he crosses literally a bridge over to the purity of clean, fresh air and what have you. This is going to be, of course, foreshadowing to the overall narrative arc of the protagonist. So there's all sorts of little things like this. The names, I think you mentioned this point here, the names are much more significant if you know the meaning of the names in Russian than they could be to you or I. By the way, I apologize for butchering some of the names here that I'm mentioning here. But nevertheless, Scott, did you want to say something more about that aspect?
Well, I mean, it's challenging for anyone reading a Russian novel to see the wide array of names being attributed to one character. They always have the three names. So Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, that's enough of a mouthful, but sometimes he's called Rodya, sometimes he's called Rodka, and this will go for all of the characters. And one wonders as a English speaker why the particular names, proper names being used for the characters at that point. Rodya would be the diminutive, so a form of, affection. Rodka would be, they would be angry with him. And then there's the formal name and so forth. That these all have nuances there that are largely lost on translations. But similarly, there is just a feature of the novel. His sister Danya had a former employer, Svidrigailov, she revealed to him that her brother was the murderer. Well, when she speaks to him, she does so in the terms of intimacy, second person singular, which in English would be expressed in thou. Even if an English translator sought to hold on to that, it would not convey that this would be the terms that one would use of somebody with whom one was either family or sexually intimate. So it suggests that they had some sort of uh, immoral conduct in the past that underlie, and then she, of course, naturally sought to shoot him. What else would she do, being Raskolnikov's sister, and then ran away herself. And then he committed suicide, so as a result of this. Now, really funny things, but again, these particular nuances of the Russian language cannot be picked up in English, and some of the depth of the novel there is lost as well. The other interesting thing is just, now this is not Russian, a Russian problem per se, but the sort of geography of some of the novel, at any rate, is taking place in St. Petersburg. Well, St. Petersburg is really the jewel in the crown of Russia. It's supposed to be the window upon the west of St. Peter, or Peter the Great, and is normally seen as a beautiful city. Well, not in this novel, it's not. It's a horrific place. When one thinks of St. Petersburg, you probably also think of ice and snow. Well, it's like a blast furnace, the way it's portrayed in the novel. So it's it's a hot, deserted place, probably symbolically representing a sort of a wasteland, a place where a trial is about to be undertaken.
Yeah, it's a lot of the action. We don't see it now so much because we're used to writing and reading dystopian novels set in squalid urban settings. It's almost a hallmark of modern literature.
True.
But this is not a common way of writing about things in Dostoevsky's day and age.
True.
If you're reading your Tolstoy, if you read War and Peace, you'll see a lot of the portrayals of cities and places like that in there in very grand, clean terms and what have you. And so you don't really encounter this squalid world here. But Dostoevsky regularly sets the heart of his action in the quiet, unimportant, dark, squalid, diseased bits of a city. And this novel, in many of its scenes, is no different than that, which is again why that bridge at the beginning from the sort of hellish setting that we start with over to the purer country is significant. It's significant on so many levels here. It also, this is just a side note here, and you mentioned that things like putting the KJE at the end of a name is when somebody's angry at you. And it just occurs to me that when my mother would get angry with me when I was a little boy, she'd call me Yunkya. And now I realize maybe that there was something to that. I was in trouble if she called me that. So interesting. So many of these sort of subtle details.
Yeah, so that's right. The suffixes have connotations to them.
Yeah.
And we do that in English to some degree. We do diminutives, like you would be Willie.
Yeah.
Right? No, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay. But yeah, that doesn't.
Yeah, don't do that. Or Billy, right? So, but the Y at the end of a name and so forth. And Scotty, that the diminutive adding a Y at the end, that's a term of affection. I don't think we have a correspondent term in most English names of I'm annoyed with you, so I'll add this suffix to the name. But they do in Russian.
Yeah. Let's come back and talk a little bit also about further aspects of Dostoevsky's faith. One of the things that he was keen to replace this utopian socialism and this rational nihilism with was not just the faith, but he would talk oftentimes about how a Christian, and indeed a human, would respond with a spontaneous Christian emotional response to the good and the evil that he or she encountered in the world. So he has this anecdote, this dream at the beginning. And I remember the scene from the dream. I was looking for it here in my copy of Crime and Punishment, and I couldn't find it. He has this dream of an old horse being beaten to death by its owner. And the rest of the peasants who are watching the drama unfold are not just callous to it, they vaguely enjoy it and find this a source of amusement and what have you, as this poor horse screaming is whipped to death. And the sheer spontaneous Christian emotion that Raskolnikov feels towards this dream, this vision, haunts him. And Dostoevsky was very keen on thinking about that and promoting a healthy emotional Christian response. But he always slapped the word Christian on there, and that's not an accident that he does so. He thought that there was something by way of natural law that is inscribed upon the human heart that gives it the ability to discern what a powerful intellectual might not see using merely intellectual faculties. And so there's a degree of authenticity that he wanted to work his way back to. Tolstoy is going to also really, really go after this notion of Christian authenticity. And with the next work that we're going to be looking at, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, his novella, we're going to see that played out in considerable detail. So this is not just a motif that Russian authors are playing with at this time. I would go so far as to say it's a leitmotif, a dominating motif that typifies much of the conversation going on in great Russian novels.
Yeah, and so from the outset, although he's utopian in his ideas and idealistic, and wants to see if he can be this great man, this Ubermensch, as we've called him, there's still a sense that he's alienated from his fellow men and from God, for that matter. And it leads him to commit the same act that the alienated figure of Cain commits in the biblical story, obviously not murdering his brother, but one of his fellow human beings. Mm-hmm. But that very act is the thing that transforms him. Something within him dies as well at the point in which he kills her. And the thing that dies within him is his common humanity. It's been destroyed in him. And there's a sort of poetic justice. But out of that death comes a new sort of life. And I mentioned at the outset, emblematized in the story of Lazarus, which is repeatedly invoked in this. So Lazarus, for those of us who are not well attuned to biblical story, is a man who Jesus is called to come and help before he dies, and he does nonetheless. Jesus tarries, he's delayed, and Lazarus dies, and we find out that that this happened at God's ordination so that they might see the power of God. So he raises him from the dead, says, Lazarus, come out, and he comes out from the grave in his grave clothes and so forth, walking around. He's been dead there for 3 days, for that matter, so there's a sort of a foreshadowing of the resurrection as well. In this story as well, there are various types of deaths and various types of resurrections, and it as I say, it repeats itself, and it's subtle, and the manner of living is also, I would say, it is reinforced and has a deeper significance each time. So I said, when he confesses his crime, you would have thought that there's some sort of a personal rejuvenation that has taken place at this point, or indeed new life at the point that he confesses. But that's not the case. When he is in prison, he says that he did it out of weakness. It's Sonia's intervention that brings him to that point, and it's actually in that third instance, he recalls that Sonia's reading of the story to him, which was the second instance of the Lazarus story, that had brought about a transformation in him. He only comes upon this idea in retrospect, however. At the time, he wasn't fully aware of it. It was like a seed that had gone in that did not sprout. It sprouts forth in retrospect, thinking back on his own life. There's a sort of hermeneutic event. He interprets what has happened retroactively and now understands his new life, and that it began when he was told the story of Lazarus and his resurrection. That's when it started, but he wasn't aware of it. It didn't motivate him, but now it does.
This actually, now that you're talking about this is fascinating, because I'm thinking back to some years ago. The author Michael O'Brien suggested a Russian movie to me that had just come out, probably in the early 2000s, and Michael suggested I watch this Russian movie about a redemptive process from an Orthodox perspective. I think it's called The Island, is translated into 2006. Right. Where we see a similar sort of thing. We start off with the protagonist, and the protagonist doesn't just behave underwhelmingly, he behaves in an absolutely evil manner. He betrays those around him who had been good to him, ends up getting them killed. He himself, by some horrible miracle, survives, and the rest of his life becomes this process of redemption and sanctification. And it's really quite painful to watch in many parts of his process. He becomes a monk. He is kind of the comic lunatic figure of his monastery. He's oftentimes deemed as insane or what have you, but there's something going on. There's a meaning behind the insanity. But the bottom line is, if it weren't for the fact that he had done great evil, the redemptive process would never have begun. And so this is an idea, again, I think that quite a number, now that I'm thinking back to also Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy and people like this, this is an idea that I think, again, Russian authors are really quite fascinated with. A horrible thing happened, and in response to that, the good thing began coming out of that. Does that mean that the horrible, evil thing was in some sense good? No, it wasn't. It was evil. It's called evil, evil, and that's what it is. Nevertheless, can God turn legitimate evil to good purposes in the case of the redemption of this individual? Yes, he can. And of course, we see that happening here with Raskolnikov one more time. We have a new.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's something distinctively orthodox in its understanding of Christianity, which again seems a little bit confusing to Western audience. More attuned to our understanding would be the Catholic portrait in a film like The Mission, which has a similar sort of, if you recall, I think it was Robert De Niro, the former slave trader. He ends up having to carry the armor up the, I mean, it's sort of a cross that he's bearing. He's doing all these terrible things to mortify the flesh, or rather to atone for the evil that he's done in the end. The priest cuts the armor and it falls down. It's like sin dropping off his back, like the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, the albatross going down. But this idea of grace and works, that's not what we see in Orthodox portraits here. It's not grace and works. It's something very different, and nonetheless deeply Christian for the author. So, and it is consistent in the portraits of the literature for sure. Did you want to say something about that, or go in a different direction here, Bill?
Well, I'm also thinking that at the beginning, of course, Raskolnikov quite naively is thinking to himself that his sin is not sin, even if he did care about sin, which he says he does not. He's beyond sin and good and stuff like this. Those are for sort of naive peasants and people who don't know any better, for the primitives and their superstitions. But of course, he nevertheless has to justify why he does what he does, at least to himself. And so he says, this evil old moneylender, Alyona, I think her name is, probably butchering that too. He says, she does evil in the world. If you look at this from a purely utilitarian perspective, utilitarian perspectives always advocate for the greatest quantity of good from an act. So if you have to, I don't know, murder 10 babies to make 100,000 people happy, then quantitatively that makes sense. And
or
so
if you're gonna commit murder, you may as well kill a bad person as opposed to just any old person,
because you'll reduce the sheer amount of malaise and evil and unhappiness in the world.
Right.
And so he thinks to himself he's justified in killing this old woman. And the old woman is, I mean, if you read the novel, she is a genuinely putrid human being. She's nasty. She's a bad piece of work. So that's not in dispute. She's a very obviously evil person doing a lot of damage in the world. Fair enough. And so, the reader might be excused for thinking to himself, well, maybe I don't agree with Raskolnikov's view of the world, but nevertheless, there might be some kind of justification to be had that alleviates a degree of his guilt when it comes to the murder. But of course, Raskolnikov doesn't just kill her. This is quite clever on the part of Dostoevsky. That was the illusion, which was justified going in, but then in comes her sister. That has to be dealt with, and so he murders a completely innocent human being. This
is not planned.
No, and moreover, the sister that he murders is somebody for whom Sonia, the young woman, had a great deal of affection for. She liked her. So he has murdered somebody held in reasonably high esteem by the one person who's contributing to the redemption.
Admires Sonia.
So when it comes to Raskolnikov's guilt, from pretty well any thinking perspective, it is unequivocal. He is guilty of doing great evil. He has become the very thing that he justified killing in the first place. Raskolnikov himself, you could argue, is worthy of the blade if it comes to that, because he's no better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And this is actually one of the things, actually, you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to pick up on this. Raskolnikov is, I would say, at least better educated than most of his peers that he encounters in the novel.
Yeah.
Is he intellectually superior? In terms of the sheer ideas that he has in his possession, yeah, he is, absolutely. Can he think critically better than those around him? Well, that's debatable. On the other hand, there are some individuals there, like his friend, Razumikin, who are pretty formidable individuals, who are also incredibly altruistic individuals. It's his friend who nurses him through one of his bouts of delirium when he's out for 4 days and stuff like this. And it's his friend who's continuously got his back and continues to show loyalty even in the darkest of circumstances to him. So Raskolnikov is in a sense being ministered.
Could I just say something about that? So it's interesting. We talked about names and how they're lost on us. Raskolnikov comes from the Russian word for schism, a raskol, and even more interesting, the Raskolniki are a group of schismatics, the old believers that broke from the Russian Orthodox Church, and Dostoevsky was himself associated with that group. So that's mid 17th century Russian history, but still Dostoevsky. So Raskolnikov has an identity which is he's a decisive or a divisive figure, a schismatic, and Razumikin that you mentioned comes from the word razum, which is reason or mind or intelligence. So he is an intellectually superior figure for sure, and has a discernment about him that Raskolnikov simply does not have. And it's, as I say, it's picked up in the names, which is lost on us.
Yeah, a lot of these figures like Sonia and Razumikin and what have you, they function, I would argue, in a relatively mimetic positive sense on Raskolnikov himself. I think that's very important. You also mentioned this this notion. This is fascinating to me, by the way. This fact that that the author and the main character's name connote a schismatic, a schism, which is because it feeds into one of the typical critical approaches to the character of Raskolnikov. And this was my experience way back in the undergraduate days when I first read Crime and Punishment, which is that the professor liked to talk about the main character as something of a schizophrenic with a dual personality and things like this. And as if there were two separate protagonists.
There's nothing connected. Yeah.
And what they'd like to emphasize, what the professor wanted to emphasize, and I've heard it emphasized since, is the actual separatedness of these two characters, which seems to me to miss the point. It's the very fact that he cannot divorce these two people, which is the problem. It's not that he has a dual personality, but it's that the dual personalities are inextricably welded at the base and they cannot be separated, and one will haunt the other.
And this is Stevenson's point in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is another sort of novel that explores the exact same sorts of things. You know, the terrible deeds of one man who happens to be connected with the socially respectable Dr. Jekyll and so forth. We have the same thing in Raskolnikov. So these are the same man, and yet there are features of them that are utterly, in some ways, divorced from one another. And yet they are not. I mean, there's no unity there. There's no coherence. There's no integrity. But nonetheless, they are the same person. And what he's saying is that is true of everyone. Furthermore, I think, right?
Yes, absolutely. So if you emphasize the separatedness, to just invent words on the spot here, if you emphasize that, you have done irreparable damage to one of the central themes of the novel. The point isn't that they're separated. The point is that they're inextricably connected, and that cannot be broken, and it will come back and it will get you. And as you say, Stevenson explores this as well. Other authors explore this also, the very fact that you cannot separate the natures of an individual man, the good from the evil, right, the natural from the intellectual.
Although to the rational man, the irrational, sinful acts of the other man make no sense either, but nonetheless he does them.
Yep.
Right? And so that's the problem.
Yeah, and we see this again, you know, this notion that the Ubermensch somehow can escape moral and spiritual consequences for his monstrous action. And as we said at the beginning, the very monstrosity of certain figures like this in literature, and then of course in sadly in actual history, are celebrated. The more horrific the deed, the more it underscores the fact that they're marked for greatness. So when we ultimately get to the Nazis actually like this notion that I can, slaughter thousands and then go have a light dinner and listen to some Bach or something like this. This marks out how far beyond good and evil you are, and the more the better. And as Dostoevsky prophetically points out, with countless figures from history at the beginning to the middle of the 20th century, this tragically turns out not to be possible. Your innate spiritual and moral nature will catch up with you. That is just an illusion that you are beyond good and evil.
So the denial of original sin, which is characteristic of the post-Enlightenment period.
Yeah, and there's a weary sense on the part of some Russian authors that, we just never learn. We keep making the same mistake historically, and then the next generation forgets the lesson. And then we do all sorts of monstrous, genocidal, crazy things again in the name of a future utopia we'll never reach. And it all crashes and burns one more time. And will this cycle ever end? And sadly, I think the answer is no, not not anytime soon.
Not till Jesus returns.
There you go.
So I want to go back to the denouement of the plot at in the epilogue, and you mentioned this and how some people had said that it doesn't really fit. It probably makes no sense. It's in some sense frustrating to them that it does take place, but recall what happens to Raskolnikov in that, and how important the idea of redemption is to a Christian, and how, as I further said, that he confessed that when he had confessed, he hadn't done it out of a sense of contrition, but out of a feeling of weakness. There is, however, in the epilogue, a point at which Sonia has done as she said she would do, which is to follow him to the prison camp, the labor prison. She's selflessly followed him there, and everyone loves Sonia because she's a selfless, good individual. So she represents something holy and good. She comes to him, and one morning he throws himself at her feet, and she's terrified by the response. And then a transformation takes place in her consciousness. And I'm going to quote here: at the same moment she understood, she knew that he loved her, and that at last the moment had come. And so the love of God, which had been mediated through Sonia, now has broken through to him so that he can reciprocate and return her love. So she's sort of a figure of God's love to Raskolnikov, and he finally embraces her in return. By embracing her, he's actually embracing the love of God that has been transmitted through this individual. Now, that's the Russian Orthodox sort of take on it in a way that is not usually found in either Protestant understandings or literature, or in Catholic literature, to my mind.
Yeah,
maybe I'm wrong there, but
well, no doubt our Orthodox listeners will correct us if correcting is needed.
I'm sure.
But yeah, one of the things you and I spoke about way back in the day when we were talking about saints and saints' lives and things of this nature is that there is a very iconic turn of mind or thinking or imagination amongst writers like this, in that things and even individuals function very much as meditative and facilitating objects in the spiritual journey of certain persons here. The icon, the idea of the icon that you pray to is not that you're praying to it, but you're praying through it. And that's its purpose. And what we forget is oftentimes these icons are portraits of people. So people can function in the same sort of a way as well.
As an icon of
exactly.
God's love.
So you're not praying to Saint Sonia in this case here, but rather she functions as a meditative tool. And the relationship is a relationship through somebody like this to God himself, who is love himself, and of which all these are distant echoes. All these other human loves within human relationships.
Yeah, this is a great point. And note that what follows that episode is that he picks up the New Testament that Sonia had given. Remember, we said that Dostoevsky had been given a New Testament when he went into the Siberian labor camp. And it reads that one thought passed through his mind: can her convictions not be mine now? Her feelings, her aspirations at least? And then he concludes with these words: But that is the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man, the story of his gradual regeneration, of his passing from one world into another, of his initiation into a new unknown life. So there is the new life there, and it's come through the icon of this individual, Sonia, whose story has now become his story. So he finds himself in the words of the New Testament, in the story of Lazarus, and the Lazarus that he read about and wanted Sonia to read about, he now identifies with himself and also with Sonia as well. So there's a transformation through story and through person and through action, which concludes the novel. And so the epilogue is absolutely essential to the structure of the novel, which, as you said earlier, some critics doubt. I think the epilogue is absolutely crucial to the story.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like I said previously, a lot of people want it to end like The Heart of Darkness ends. And if it ended there at the end of book 6, then remember, Dostoevsky is critiquing directly, explicitly targeting, amongst other things, rational nihilism. He's certainly not going to leave his narrative in that nihilistic ending, not a chance of it. And so, yeah, when people complain about the ending, that usually says more about the reader and their sensibilities than it does about the actual quality of the novel itself. You're also right in that it is differentiated very much from a Catholic approach to sanctification and redemption, insofar as you say, the confession. A Catholic would recognize immediately that the confession of Raskolnikov, insofar as it derives from weakness, is a confession of attrition rather than contrition.
Yeah.
And therefore, this is the bad species of confession.
It's not a real confession at all.
No, it's not. But of course, if you're coming at this from an Orthodox perspective, of course, your take on that's going to be rather different. Indeed, that's exactly what we find here. So, all very interesting, Scott.
So, I mean, I think we've done what we want to do with these podcasts with this one here, which is to give a general outline of this great author and the primary features of the work that we feel we can at least enlighten in one episode. There's a lot more that we could say if we're going to take greater time and pains to do so. But I think we've given a good introduction to the Russian novel here with Dostoevsky. As you mentioned earlier, we are thinking Tolstoy next week with the death of Ivan Ilyich. I think we'll find some very similar themes and motifs there. It's a very different work, but at the same time has remarkable similarities in a way that I think will intrigue our listeners. At least that's my thought.
I would say of this here, we can talk. Our listeners might actually even be in a position to, if they haven't read that novella yet, they're probably in a position where they can get that read in
short
time for the next podcast. So that might, just to sort of cue you, if you're interested in doing that, that might be something that you find productive and useful.
Yeah. I'm going to give it all away, by the way. Ivan Ilyich is dead when you start the novel. Yeah, he doesn't die at the end. He's dead at the beginning. So that's plot spoiler right there. Anyway, but as you've said, and we've reiterated, the reason we do the great works we do is not because we're worried about giving away the plot. The reason that they are great is you can keep on reading them and benefit from them. So we're not going to ruin it for you. We're hoping to enhance your reading. At any rate, I think that's it for us today, Bill.
Yep, that's it.
Well, then I'm Dr. Scott Masson, again with Paideia today, along with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Bill Friesen. We'll see you next time.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Take care.